There is a sequence of things that Donald Trump said on Friday, May 7th, that I want to lay out in the exact order he said them, not because any individual statement is surprising, but because the sequence read together tells you something about the structure of American decision-making on Iran that the individual statements taken alone do not reveal. First, Trump told reporters before departing for Florida that he was not satisfied with Iran's latest proposal. He said Iran is asking for things he cannot agree to. He said Iran's leadership is very disjointed and messed up. 2 to 3 groups, maybe 4, all wanting a deal, but none able to agree on what to offer. Second, Trump said, frankly, maybe we're better off not making a deal at all. Do you want to know the truth? Because we can't let this thing go on. Been going on too long. Third, Trump described his options as, do we want to go and just blast the hell out of them and finish them forever? Or do we want to try and make a deal? That's the options. Fourth, Trump said, on a human basis, I'd prefer not. Meaning he prefers not to blast them. But that's the option. Do we want to go in there heavy and just blast them away? Or do we want to do something? Fifth, Trump called the War Powers Resolution, the law that requires congressional authorization after 60 days, totally unconstitutional. He dismissed the 60-day deadline that his own White House had just formally reported to Congress was now past its term. Sixth, the White House sent a letter to House Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate President pro tempore Chuck Grassley formally declaring that hostilities with Iran have terminated. The letter stated, the hostilities that began on February 28, 2026 have terminated. Seventh, the naval blockade of Iranian ports continued running. Ships were still being interdicted. 42 vessels have been redirected. 3 have been seized. Brent crude is at $125. Better off without a deal. Blast hell out of them. War powers unconstitutional. Hostilities terminated. Blockade still running. 5 positions from the same man, the same day. Let me explain why all 5 are true simultaneously and what that tells you about where this war actually stands. Let me start with the War Powers letter, because this is the most legally significant thing that happened on Friday, and it deserves more attention than it is getting. The White House sent a formal letter to the congressional leadership stating that the hostilities with Iran have terminated. This letter was sent under the War Powers Resolution, the very law Trump called totally unconstitutional in the same breath. The administration dismissed the law's authority, and then it filed the law's required reporting. Both things happened on the same day. That is not a contradiction. That is a specific legal strategy. By formally notifying Congress that hostilities have terminated, the Trump administration is arguing that the 60-day clock, which by any reading began when the bombing started on February 28th, has expired without requiring congressional authorization because the hostilities that triggered the clock are now over. The ceasefire declared April 7th is the administration's evidence. No exchange of fire between United States forces and Iran since April 7th. Therefore, hostilities terminated. Therefore, the clock stops at April 7th, and the 60 days that elapsed before April 7 are what they are, but they are done. This is the same argument Hegseth made to senators last week, now formalized in a presidential letter. And it is specifically designed to preempt the constitutional confrontation that Collins, Murkowski, and Curtis were beginning to build. If the administration files a War Powers Resolution notification saying hostilities have terminated, it removes the emergency that those senators were using to justify demanding an AUMF. No ongoing hostilities means no 60-day clock still running, which means the constitutional crisis over congressional authorization is legally resolved. Except the blockade is still running. Senator Tim Kaine was the first to respond. He said the letter does not pass the laugh test. He said you cannot send a ship to seize Iranian vessels and then tell Congress the war is over. Adam Smith, ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, said the blockade is not a peacetime activity. Senator Chris Murphy pointed to what he called the absurdity of the administration's position. American warships are actively interdicting commerce in the Strait of Hormuz. 3 vessels have been seized by force. The IRGC is continuing to seize ships. Brent crude is at 125. And the White House has told Congress the hostilities have terminated. The administration's position is that a ceasefire and a blockade are legally different things. A ceasefire stops the shooting. A blockade restricts shipping. Shooting is hostilities under the War Powers Resolution. Restricting shipping is a naval operation, which has a different legal classification. Trump can have a blockade without having hostilities. The blockade is not a war. The war is over. The blockade is an ongoing military operation conducted in peacetime. That argument has historical precedent. The United States maintained a naval blockade of Cuba during the Kennedy administration's 1962 missile crisis. It called it a quarantine, not a blockade, specifically to avoid the international legal implications of the term. America has used naval interdiction in many contexts without formally declaring war. The law of naval blockade under international law is distinct from the law of armed conflict, but the precedents Kaine and Murphy are pointing to are more recent. The USS Tuska was fired on. The MSC Francesca was boarded with weapons drawn. Iranian gunboats have exchanged fire with American vessels in the Strait multiple times. 15 Filipino sailors are in Iranian custody. Iran's armed forces senior officials said this week that the blockade will soon be met with practical and unprecedented action, and that Iran's patience has limits and a punishing response is necessary if the blockade continues. That does not describe a peacetime naval operation. That describes an active conflict in which both sides are using force, threatening more force, and positioning for escalation. The letter saying hostilities terminated is legally precise and operationally false simultaneously, which is why Kaine said it doesn't pass the laugh test. Now let me explain Trump's maybe no deal statement, because it is the most strategically significant thing he said on Friday, and it is being treated mostly as Trump being dramatic. He said, frankly, maybe we're better off not making a deal at all. Do you want to know the truth? Because we can't let this thing go on. Been going on too long. There are two possible readings of this. The first reading is that Trump genuinely believes a deal is not achievable on terms America can accept and is beginning to prepare the public for an escalation rather than a negotiation. The second reading is that this is the most conventional negotiating tactic in existence. Tell the other side you don't need a deal, watch them move toward your terms, and then accept their movement as a concession. Every real estate negotiator, every businessman who has ever walked away from a table to get a better price knows this move. And Trump has made his career on exactly this move. The question is which reading is accurate, and the evidence points to both being simultaneously partially true, which is the most uncomfortable possible answer. It is partially true that a deal may not be achievable on terms America can accept. Trump said Iran is asking for things he cannot agree to. He said Iran told him they want a 25-year nuclear deal. He rejected it. He said it comes down to blast or deal. He said on a human basis he prefers deal. All of that is a president who has not abandoned the negotiating track, but who is genuinely frustrated that the track is not producing results on his timeline. But it is also partially true that saying maybe no deal is a negotiating move. Trump received an updated CENTCOM briefing on military options to resume bombing on Thursday night. He mentioned this explicitly. He is telling Iran, I have the options. I am being briefed on the options. The question is whether you give me a reason to not use them. The phrase cry uncle that Trump used in his Axios interview captures this. He said it was time for Iran to cry uncle and say, we give up. Cry uncle is the language of the schoolyard. The moment when the weaker party acknowledges the stronger party's dominance and the struggle ends. Trump wants Iran to make that acknowledgement before any deal is made. Iran's position, held consistently throughout this war, is that they will not make that acknowledgement under blockade. They will negotiate from a position of dignity or not at all. That gap between cry uncle and dignity is the actual obstacle to any deal, not the specific terms of nuclear timelines or Hormuz management or ceasefire guarantees. Those are resolvable. The fundamental obstacle is that Trump needs Iran to perform submission, and Iran will not perform submission while the blockade is running. Now let me add the most significant number from Friday that nobody is treating as the headline it deserves. A Washington Post, ABC News, and Ipsos poll released on Friday found that 61% of Americans say it was a mistake for the United States to use military force against Iran. 61%. The Post noted that this is on par with the 59% who called the Iraq War a mistake in a May 2006 post-ABC poll, 3 years into that war. A Gallup poll from 1971 found that roughly 6 in 10 Americans said the same thing about Vietnam. 9 in 10 Democrats say the Iran war was a mistake. 71% of independents say it was a mistake, and 19% of Republicans. That last number is the most significant. 19% of Republicans. That is not a trivial minority within Trump's coalition. 1 in 5 Republicans is telling a pollster that the military action against Iran was a mistake, and 23% of all Americans, roughly 1 in 4, say they are now falling behind financially, up from 17% in February when the war began. That is 6 percentage points of financial hardship that have emerged in 63 days, attributable in significant part to $125 oil, $4.30 gas, and the supply chain disruptions flowing from Hormuz. Trump is watching this poll. He always watches polls. The fact that he is saying maybe no deal is better, maybe blast them and finish them forever, on the same day that a poll shows 61% of Americans say the war was a mistake, is not a coincidence. He is recalibrating his public message toward resolution one way or another, either a deal or a resumption that he frames as finishing it so it never comes back. Been going on too long. Now let me add the Pakistan element, because it is the story that is most buried in Friday's coverage and most revealing about the war's actual trajectory. Annie reported on Friday that Pakistan has opened 6 overland transit routes for goods destined for Iran. Pakistan's Ministry of Commerce issued the Transit of Goods Through Territory of Pakistan Order 2026 on April 25th, allowing goods from third countries to be transported by road into Iran with immediate effect. Thousands of shipping containers are stranded at Karachi port amid U.S. restrictions on Iranian ports, and the Pakistan land routes are the mechanism for getting them through. Trump, when asked about this by A&E, said he was aware of the development and expressed support for Pakistan's leadership. He said he has great respect for Pakistan, for Field Marshal Munir, and for the Prime Minister. Read that carefully. America's Pakistan ally has opened 6 land routes specifically for Iran to bypass the naval blockade. And America's president says he has great respect for the people who did it. This is not a breakdown in American-Pakistani relations. This is Trump choosing consciously to allow Pakistan to provide Iran with a partial economic lifeline while maintaining the naval pressure on the maritime routes. It is a valve, a controlled release of pressure. Iran gets some goods through land routes, which reduces the likelihood that the pressure becomes so extreme that Iran's leadership is forced into a catastrophic escalation. America maintains the naval pressure, which is the coercive instrument, and Pakistan manages the middle. That is a more sophisticated strategic posture than blast or deal suggests. It is blast or deal or Pakistan valve, and Trump endorsed the Pakistan valve on Friday while simultaneously saying maybe blast. Now let me steelman the hostilities terminated claim, because the administration is not wrong about everything. The ceasefire has held in the specific sense that no American bombs have fallen on Iran since April 7th. No Iranian missiles have struck American military installations since April 7th. The kinetic exchange of fire that characterized the first 40 days of the war has not recurred. American and Iranian forces have not directly engaged with lethal force at the level of the initial strikes. In that narrow, specific sense, hostilities as a term of art in the law of armed conflict may genuinely be over, and the administration can legitimately argue that the War Powers Resolution's 60-day clock is intended to address the scenario where a president commits troops to sustained combat without congressional authorization, not a scenario where a president orders strikes, declares a ceasefire, and maintains a naval interdiction operation. The 60-day deadline is not designed to apply to every naval deployment. The United States Navy deploys around the world constantly without triggering 60-day clocks. If every naval interdiction operation triggered the War Powers Resolution, the law would paralyze American naval operations globally. Here is where the steel man collapses. This specific naval operation is not a routine deployment. It is a blockade of a country's ports that has been declared in the context of a war against that country, that is enforced with seizure of ships, and that has produced $125 oil, a global supply disruption the UN Secretary General called potentially devastating, and an explicit threat from Iran's armed forces that patience has limits and a punishing response is necessary. That is not routine naval operations. That is the continuation of a war by other means. And Friday's poll tells you that 61% of Americans understand this. They watched the war start. They watched the ceasefire declared. They watched the blockade continue. They watched the gas prices rise. They watched the Senate vote 6 times and leave town. They watched the White House say hostilities terminated while ships were being seized. And 61% of them said, mistake. Trump heard that number. He got on Marine One and flew to Florida, saying maybe better off without a deal and maybe blast them forever. And the blockade kept running while he said both. Watch whether Araghchi's Friday calls to Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the EU's Kaja Kallas produce any new coordinated position from those countries on the Hormuz dispute. The EU foreign policy chief calling Araghchi is the most underreported diplomatic development of the week. If Europe and the Gulf states are aligning around a Hormuz framework that does not require Iranian nuclear surrender as a precondition, that framework could become the basis for an agreement that bypasses the cry uncle problem entirely. And watch whether Pakistan's land routes see any significant increase in traffic in the next 2 weeks. If they do, Iran is absorbing the blockade through land corridors, and the naval pressure's effectiveness is diminishing regardless of how many ships are interdicted at sea. Trump said, no deal may be better. The White House said the war is over. The blockade is still running. And 61% of Americans say the war was a mistake. All 4 of those things are true today. And only one of them is getting better for the Trump administration over time. If you found this useful, push back on it in the comments. I will see you in the next one. And here is the number that completes the picture that the poll paints. 48% of Americans say the U.S. should make a peace deal with Iran, even if it results in a worse deal for the U.S. 46% say the U.S. should push Iran for a better deal, even if that means resuming military action. That 48 versus 46 split is remarkable. The American public is almost exactly divided between accepting less to end this sooner and demanding more and risking escalation. Within that 50-50 division, Trump is the one person whose decision determines which path is taken. The 61% who said mistake cannot directly affect the outcome. The 48 versus 46 split tells you what the American public would choose if given the choice. And it tells Trump that making a deal, even a less than perfect deal, is what the majority of Americans, including that 19% of Republicans, would accept and possibly even reward. Been going on too long might be Trump reading all of those numbers simultaneously and processing them out loud. Let me also explain the cry uncle phrase. Because Trump used it in an Axios interview this week, and it is the most precise description of what America actually wants from Iran that has been made publicly by anyone in the administration. Trump said it was time for Iran to cry uncle. The phrase means the moment when the weaker party in a physical struggle acknowledges the dominant party's power and the struggle ends, not a negotiated settlement where both parties make concessions. An acknowledgement of dominance, a submission. That is not the language of a deal. That is the language of surrender. And that specific language tells you why every proposal Iran submits gets rejected. Araghchi presented a proposal. Trump said not satisfactory. Iran revised the proposal. Trump said not enough. Iran is submitting proposals that describe a negotiated settlement where both parties make concessions. Trump is looking for a proposal that constitutes cry uncle. Iran will not submit that proposal under blockade. This is not Iranian stubbornness. It is the structural reality that a government submitting to a naval blockade while simultaneously saying we give up has no political survivability in Tehran. Pezeshkian, Araghchi, and even the IRGC generals know this. They can make concessions, they can agree to timelines and verification mechanisms. They cannot perform submission. And Trump's cry uncle framing requires performance of submission. That gap is the real obstacle. $125 Brent is the market's pricing of how long it will take to close that gap. The poll showing 61% of Americans calling the war a mistake is the political cost accumulating while the gap remains open. And the White House saying hostilities terminated while the blockade runs is the legal architecture being constructed to avoid a constitutional crisis while the gap stays open indefinitely. Araghchi made calls on Friday to Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and the EU's Kaja Kallas. That is 7 phone calls in one day to regional and international partners, briefing them on Iran's latest negotiating position. A country performing submission does not make 7 outbound diplomatic calls the same day. It waits for instructions. Iran is not waiting. Iran is building the international consensus framework that would allow a deal to happen without the cry uncle moment Trump says he is waiting for. The blockade is the instrument. The 61% is the political pressure. The cry uncle is the actual ask. And none of those 3 things are aligned in a way that produces an ending in the near term. Watch the EU foreign policy chief Kallas's follow-up with Araghchi. Europe calling Iran directly is significant. Watch Pakistan's land routes data. Watch whether Brent falls below 120 before any new proposal arrives. If it does, someone in the market knows something about the talks that has not yet been made public. And watch whether Trump says anything more specific about what not asking for things I can't agree to means in terms of nuclear timelines. The specific gap he is describing is the most important unknown in this entire conflict. Everyone knows Iran won't say zero enrichment. The question is what timeline, what verification, what mechanism could produce a deal that Trump can describe as complete prevention without requiring Iran to cry uncle on camera. No deal may be better. The White House said the war is over. The blockade is still running. 61% of Americans said mistake. And Friday ended with a president on his way to Florida who had described his options as blast or deal and said on a human basis he prefers not. On a human basis he prefers not. Hold that phrase. It will tell you more about how this ends than anything else said on Friday. If you found this useful, push back on it in the comments. I will see you in the next one.